Yesterday, the final ledger of the 2025-2026 tariff cycle arrived, revealing that the American experiment in autarky did not just fail. It accelerated the very geopolitical fragmentation Washington sought to prevent. When Donald Trump held up that chart in the Rose Garden on April 2, 2025, calling it Liberation Day, the administration pitched a narrative of economic restoration. They argued that unilateral tariffs were the ultimate leverage, a blunt force instrument to bring supply chains back across the border and force a permanent, submissive realignment of global trade. That was the official script, a controlled economic correction to solve a 50-year-old grievance. But that is only the surface-level theatre. The real architecture of this moment was a systemic miscalculation of how deeply the modern global economy has been integrated into, and subsequently hardened against, American protectionism. The timeline of this collapse is a masterclass in unintended consequences. On April 5, 2025, Executive Order 14,257 went live, casting a 10% net over the entire import landscape. 4 days later, the specific punitive rates for 60 nations triggered. We were told this was a targeted surgical strike on trade deficits, yet the math tells a different story. The White House formula, trade deficit divided by imports, treated competitiveness as a crime. It penalised nations not because they were cheating, but because their exports were in demand. By the time the S&P 500 shed 10% of its value in 48 hours, and the IMF downgraded global growth forecasts by 0.5 percentage point, it was clear this was not a trade negotiation. It was a tax on the domestic consumer, paid at the cash register, hidden behind the veneer of national security. The strategic pivot point, however, arrived on July 10, 2025. By targeting Canada, the United States' largest export market, with a 35% tariff justified by a transparently hollow fentanyl narrative, the administration broke the final thread of the post-WWI economic pact. In Washington, they assumed Canada would fold under the pressure, just as they assumed the tariff math would force capitulation. They misread the domestic reality of their partner. Prime Minister Mark Carney's not-for-sale declaration wasn't just rhetoric. It was the signal that Canada had crossed the Rubicon. Within weeks, the political calculus in Ottawa inverted, turning a 20-point polling deficit into a mandate for survival. Consider the sequence. Canada did not just protest, it reallocated. The federal budget shifted from a reliance on the American industrial machine to a state-led infrastructure campaign aimed directly at Asia and Europe. The data from the second quarter of 2025 provides the evidence of this shift, with Canadian exports to the US plummeting by 15% and Ontario manufacturing shedding 40,000 jobs. But instead of triggering a political collapse for the Liberals, the economic pain reinforced a newfound national consensus that the decades-long integration with the US economy was no longer a pillar of strength, but a structural vulnerability that threatened sovereign decision-making, even when the legal foundation for this entire campaign was shredded on February 20, 2026, by the Supreme Court's ruling in Learning Resources Inc. v. Trump, which correctly identified that the president had usurped Congress's taxing power. The damage to the global order remained. The court struck down the authority, yet the costs remained baked into the global system. Supply chains, once moved, do not return simply because a court rules an executive order unconstitutional. Corporations, facing the new volatility of a lawless tariff regime, have already begun building redundancy elsewhere. The United States effectively spent its last major card of economic hegemony. It traded a century of influence for a temporary spike in revenue that ultimately created domestic growth. We are witnessing the end of the American anchored trade era, replaced by a fractured landscape where former allies are no longer waiting for Washington to stabilize. The strategic question is no longer whether these tariffs are effective or legal. It is how long the remaining pieces of the global supply chain can hold together while the center of that system continues to pursue its own dismantling. What comes next is not a return to the status quo, but a race to build a world that is designed to function without American permission. The deal that never was, the failure of the US executive branch to secure a surrender from its largest trading partner, was not a collapse of negotiation, but the inevitable conclusion of a policy built on a fundamental misunderstanding of the Canadian economic lever. To understand why, we have to look at the granular architecture of the White House's trade strategy, which prioritized numerical reciprocity over the reality of integrated supply chains. First, consider the mechanism. Executive Order 14,257 relied on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, to bypass congressional tax authority, framing the trade deficit not as a balance of payments outcome, but as a national emergency. By calculating tariffs based on the trade deficit divided by total imports, the administration essentially taxed competitive efficiency. If a Canadian manufacturer could produce an auto part cheaper or more efficiently than a US counterpart, that efficiency was treated as a structural injury to be punished by a tariff rate designed to equalize the imbalance. This was not a tax on the foreign government, it was a tax on the American supply chain, which had been built over decades on the assumption of frictionless, low-tariff, cross-border movement. Second, the players involved in the Canadian negotiation were operating under conflicting models of power. The White House, driven by a view of global trade as a zero-sum game, believed that imposing a 35% tariff would act as a vice, forcing Ottawa to concede on sectoral demands like aluminum, steel, and energy access. Their calculation was that Canada, with its 76% export reliance on the American market, would have no choice but to offer concessions, effectively a commitment to buy more US goods or restrict its own resource exports to satisfy the White House's demand for a reduced deficit. Third, the structural flaw in the US approach was its failure to account for political elasticity. When Prime Minister Mark Carney arrived at the Oval Office, he was not acting as a petitioner seeking a return to the status quo. His government's Canada-strong budget and the subsequent pivot to Asian and European markets represented a systemic decoupling. Carney did not come to negotiate the tariffs, he came to declare the end of the integrated era. By refusing to engage in a tit-for-tat on the specific percentages and instead framing the crisis as an existential push for sovereignty, the Canadian government effectively stripped the US of its most potent weapon, the threat of isolation. The financial terms were in effect a dead end. When the White House offered to waive the 35% tariff in exchange for Canada's commitment to restrictive US-led resource quotas, they were asking Ottawa to trade its long-term economic autonomy for short-term relief from a tax that was already destroying domestic US manufacturing costs. The refusal to take that deal, not for sale ever, was the moment the Liberation Day narrative finally disintegrated. It signalled that Canada, far from being the compliant 51st state of the American imagination, had decided the cost of entry into the US market was no longer worth the loss of global strategic freedom. What remains is a trade landscape defined by redirected flows. The infrastructure projects launched in 2025, the rail corridors to northern ports, the critical mineral agreements with EU partners are not just policies, they are physical manifestations of a new reality. The capital and labour that once focused exclusively on the north-south axis are being rerouted, creating a permanent divergence in the North American market. If the goal of the tariff campaign was to force Canada into a subordinate role, it has failed by every metric of long-term economic integration. The question that remains for the policy architects in Washington is what happens to the US supply chain when its most reliable, resource-rich partner decides that being the largest US trading partner is a position to be exited rather than a privilege to be defended. The aggressive tariff campaign of 2025 has achieved its most decisive result. It has effectively ended the era of North American economic integration as a reliable, foundational constant. By weaponizing trade against its closest ally, Washington did not force a return to a favorable status quo. Instead, it accelerated a permanent, structural departure that has forced Canada to build a defensive and independent economic architecture that no longer assumes the United States will be its partner of first resort. The strategic implications of this shift are profound and irreversible. We have moved from a period defined by the USMCA's promise of regional harmonization to a new reality defined by diversification as survival for Canada. The energy and resource sectors, long the bedrock of the cross-border industrial machine, are now being intentionally redirected toward European and Asian markets. This is not a temporary adjustment to a policy cycle. It is a calculated effort to insulate the Canadian economy from the volatility of US political whims. Washington's attempt to use tariffs as a lever for control has, in effect, successfully incentivized the creation of alternatives that will diminish US influence over the long term. Global alliances, too, have been fundamentally altered. The American arm-twisting strategy, demanding concessions, investment, and resource priority from NATO partners and neighbours alike, has transformed the perception of the United States from an anchor of the global rules-based order to an unpredictable, high-risk actor. Europe, Japan, and now Canada are operating with a newfound awareness that their national interests are no longer automatically aligned with Washington's. This has led to a fragmented trade landscape where reliability is the most expensive commodity on the market. Multinational corporations, which once built their supply chains for maximum efficiency across borders, are now re-engineering them for maximum resilience against border risk. Compare this to the pre-2025 era, when the predictability of the US market was treated as a given. Businesses invested billions in the assumption that the rule of law and stable trade relations were fixed variables. Today, those variables are active risks. The Supreme Court's intervention in early 2026, while striking down the legal basis for the tariffs, did not undo the economic geography that was already being rewritten. When capital moves to accommodate a 35% tariff barrier, it does not magically flow back once the tariff is legally invalidated. It stays where it has found security. We are now approaching the next critical juncture, the mid-2026 USMCA review. This is no longer a routine checkup on a trade agreement. It is the moment of truth for the entire North American model. The real test is not just whether the agreement survives on paper, but whether there is enough trust left to make it worth the cost. The Canadian government is not just preparing to negotiate trade terms, it is preparing for a world where the US relationship is just one of many, and arguably the most volatile. The big picture is clear. The tariff experiment has stripped away the illusion of an inseparable, mutually beneficial partnership, exposing a deeper, more transactional, and increasingly competitive reality. The question is no longer whether Canada can stand up to the United States, but whether the United States can afford to be the outlier in a world that is already moving toward a new, decentralized trade order. The decision point is arriving, and for those who have been watching the map